In times of uncertainty, people reach for historical analogies. After 9/11, the W. Bush administration officials used Pearl Harbor as a standard comparison in processing the intelligence failure. Secretary of State Colin Powell referred to Japan's attack to make the case that Washington should deliver an ultimatum to the Taliban. Today's favorite analogy is the Cold War. The United States again faces an adversary that has global reach and insatiable ambition, with China taking the place of the Soviet Union. This is an attractive comparison because the United States and its allies won the Cold War, but the current period is more dangerous. China is not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was self-isolating, whereas China ended its isolation in the late 1970s. A second difference between the Soviet Union and China is the role of ideology. Under the Brezhnev doctrine that governed Eastern Europe, an ally had to be a carbon copy of Soviet-style communism. China, by contrast, is largely agnostic about the internal composition of other states. It defends the superiority of the Chinese Communist Party, but does not insist that others do the same, although is happy to support authoritarian states by exporting its surveillance technology and social media services. So if the current competition is not Cold War 2.0, then what is it? We may find more food for thought in the imperialism of the late 19th century and the economies of the interwar period. Now, like then, revisionist powers are acquiring territory through force, and the international order is breaking down. Perhaps the most striking and worrying similarity is that today, as in the previous eras, the United States is tempted to turn inward. While previous eras of competition were characterized by great power clashes, during the Cold War, territorial conflict was fought largely through proxies. Moscow mostly confined its use of military force to its own sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, as when it crushed uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan crossed a new line, but the move did not fundamentally challenge U.S. interests, and the conflict eventually became a proxy war. Where Soviet and U.S. forces did face each other directly across the German divide, the extreme danger of the two Berlin crises gave way to a kind of tense stability thanks to nuclear deterrence. Today's security landscape features the danger of direct military conflict between great powers. China's territorial claims challenge U.S. allies from Japan to the Philippines and other U.S. partners in the region such as India and Vietnam. Long-held U.S. interests such as freedom of navigation run into direct conflict with China's maritime ambitions. Then there is Taiwan. An attack on Taiwan would require a U.S. military response, even if the policy of strategic ambiguity created uncertainty about the nature of it. For years, the United States has acted as a kind of rheostat in the Taiwan Strait, with the goal of preserving the status quo. Since 1979, administrations from both parties have sold arms to Taiwan. President Bill Clinton deployed the USS Independence to the Strait in 1996 in response to Beijing's aggressive activity. In 2003, the Bush administration publicly chastised Taiwanese President Chen Shui-bian when he proposed a referendum that sounded very much like a vote on independence. All along, the goal was to maintain or occasionally restore what had become a relatively stable status quo. In recent years, Beijing's aggressive military activities around Taiwan have challenged that. In Washington, strategic ambiguity has largely given way to open discussion of how to deter a Chinese invasion, but Beijing could threaten Taiwan in other ways. It could blockade the island, as Chinese forces have practiced in exercises, or it could seize small, uninhabited Taiwanese islands, cut underwater cables, or launch large-scale cyber attacks. These strategies might be smarter than a risky and difficult assault on Taiwan, and would complicate a U.S. response. The overarching point is that Beijing has Taiwan in its sights. Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who views the island as a rogue province, wants to complete the restoration of China and take his place in the pantheon of leaders next to Mao Zedong. Hong Kong is now effectively a province of China, and bringing Taiwan to heel would fulfill Xi's ambition that risks open conflict between U.S. and Chinese forces. The United States and China have none of the de-conflict measures in place that the United States and Russia do. During the 2008 war in Georgia, for instance, Michael Mullen, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had ongoing contact with his Russian counterpart, Nikolai Makarov, to avoid an incident as the U.S. Air Force flew Georgian troops home from Iraq to join the fight. In 2001, when a hot-dogging Chinese pilot hit a U.S. reconnaissance plane and forced it to the ground. The crew was detained on Hainan Island, and for 3 days, Washington was unable to make high-level contact with the Chinese leadership. The reopening of military-to-military contacts with China earlier this year, after a 4-year freeze, was a welcome development, but it is a far cry from the types of procedures and lines of communication needed to prevent accidental catastrophe. China's conventional military modernization is impressive and accelerating. The country now has over 370 ships and submarines. The growth in China's nuclear arsenal is also alarming. In the final 2012 presidential debate, U.S. President Barack Obama argued that his opponent, Mitt Romney, was overhyping the danger from Russia, suggesting that the country was no longer a geopolitical threat. With the 2014 annexation of Crimea, it became clear that Russian President Vladimir Putin begged to differ. The next step, Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, has brought his ambition to restore the Russian Empire face to face with the red lines of Article 5 of NATO's founding treaty, which stipulates that an attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. Early in the war, NATO worried that Moscow might attack supply lines in Poland and Romania, both members of the alliance. So far, Putin has shown no appetite for triggering Article 5, but the Black Sea, which the Tsars considered a Russian lake, has again become a source of conflict and tension. Remarkably, Ukraine, a country that barely has a navy, has successfully challenged Russian naval power and can now move grain along its own coastline. Even more devastating for Putin, his gambit has produced a strategic alignment among Europe, the United States, and much of the rest of the world, leading to extensive sanctions against Russia. It is now an isolated and heavily militarized state. Putin never thought it would turn out this way. Moscow initially predicted Ukraine would fall within days of the invasion. Russian forces were carrying 3 days' worth of provisions and dress uniforms for the parade they expected to hold in Kyiv. The embarrassing first year of the war exposed the weaknesses of the Russian armed forces, which turned out to be riddled with corruption and incompetence, but as it has done throughout its history, Russia has stabilized the front, relying on old-fashioned tactics such as human wave attacks, trenches, and landmines. The incremental way in which the United States and its allies supplied weapons to Ukraine, first debating whether to send tanks, then doing so and so on, gave Moscow breathing room to mobilize its defense industrial base and throw its huge manpower advantage at the Ukrainians. Still, the economic toll will haunt Moscow for years to come. An estimated 1 million Russians fled their country in response to Putin's war, many of them young and well-educated. Russia's oil and gas industry has been crippled by the loss of important markets, and the withdrawal of the multinational oil giants BP, Exxon, and Shell. Russia's talented central banker Elvira Nabiullina has covered up many of the economy's vulnerabilities, walking a tightrope without access to the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets held in the West. And China has stepped in to take off some of the pressure, but the cracks in the Russian economy are showing. According to Gazprom, the energy giant, the company's revenue will stay below its pre-war level for at least 10 years because of the invasion. Thoughtful economic players in Moscow are worried, but Putin cannot lose this war. He seems willing to sacrifice everything to prevent disaster, as Germany's interwar period showed us. An isolated, militarized, declining power is dangerous. The challenge is complicated by Russia's growing cooperation with China, Iran, and North Korea. The countries have a common cause: to undermine the U.S.-led international system that they hate, but their strategic interests are not easy to harmonize. Beijing cannot let Putin lose, but likely has no real enthusiasm for his adventurism on behalf of a new Russian empire, particularly if it puts China in the crosshairs for secondary sanctions on its own struggling economy. The growth of Chinese power in Central Asia is not likely to warm the hearts of the xenophobes in the Kremlin. China's ambitions complicate Russia's relations with India, who is moving toward the United States.